Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Marjan Greenblatt. She is a human rights activist who works with women's issues and minorities, particularly in the Middle East, Iran especially. And we'll be discussing with her the overall situation in the Middle East and specifically Iran's footprint concerning the current events and everything that happened since October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and of course the context leading up to that. Marjan, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Hi, Irina. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. And could you start by introducing yourself and your background a little bit to the audience? Tell us a little how you got involved in this area and what sort of things you've encountered along the way.
Thank you. I was born and raised in Iran. I was 7 years old when the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran and changed my life completely. And overnight, we could see that life was no longer what it was. The promises, the hopes, the freedoms that we once experienced, even as a young child, I saw that all going away. And from that moment on, it became the ambition, the main ambition for many of us living in Iran, particularly the religious minorities and particularly the Jewish religious minorities, was to escape the country and find a free life outside of Iran where we could practice our religion and be who we wanted to be, have freedom as equal human beings, because whether we are men, women, or any religious practice, so that we could have an equal and fair and free life. I moved to the US when I was a teenager, and from that point on, my whole mission in life was to be a good American citizen and participate and give back to the country that has helped me to such a great extent. But about 10 years ago exactly, when there were conversations about beginning a new so-called diplomatic relationship with the Islamic Republic, based on the hope of a new reformist president, and at the time, Hassan Rouhani was taking shape in Washington, D.C., I, who happened to live in Washington, but I really was a Washington outsider. I love that term, by the way, for the name of your show. I thought that it was incumbent upon me to actually step in and share the little bit that I knew about the fallacy of reform or reformist promises in Iran. And by reflecting some of the human rights violations that are taking place every day in Iran, and particularly affect women and minorities, whether religious or ethnic minorities in the country. And so from that point on, I started my involvement first through the Alliance for Rights of All Minorities. And then again, about 3 years ago, I launched a subsidiary initiative called Stop Femicide Iran, where we shed light on the prevalence of murder of women in the name of honor or power or just ease of the act of murder that is taking place and affecting women and girls in Iran. I am also a non-resident scholar at Middle East Institute and a member of Anti-Defamation League's. Actually, I'm the co-chair of the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force for Middle East Minorities. So I really come at this from the perspective of an observer of human rights violations in Iran. And I look forward to your questions for today.
So my first question may seem have nothing to have nothing to do with the situation with Hamas, but don't worry, I will get there. A year ago, we've seen a wave of protests in Iran related to Mahsa Amini's murder, and we have seen a wave of support from the West, which unfortunately was short-lived. Perhaps it helped to contribute to the destabilization of the Iranian regime, perhaps not, but there was a period of time where there seemed to be an active outpouring of concern. This year, we have seen Iran crack down further on women, and we have seen quite recently another tragic death of a 16-year-old girl under very similar circumstances at the hands of the Iranian authorities. But this time, the international reaction was quite different, and this happened before the instant war between Israel and Hamas. So we can't say that there's this major distraction now. There is, but this happened prior to these events, and we have seen that there was largely silence, very limited media coverage of this incident, and just general passivity and apparent disinterest. How can you explain that a year after all this, seemingly heartfelt pressure for better treatment of women, and when somebody dies under the exact same circumstances, there's suddenly a completely different reaction?
So this is a very important point of comparison, and one that many of us, who are observing the brutality that was exercised by Hamas in Israel against Israeli civilians, particularly the women, and also watched the level of support that came out of the Mahsa Amini movement a year ago in Iran. We're comparing it, and some are feeling that the level of support that was given to the Iranian women is not being reciprocated right now with the brutality that was unleashed on Israeli civilians and Israeli women and girls. What I would say about this actually is that the support was never enough to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Even the level of response that we experienced during the Mahsa Amini, the Zan Zendegi Azadi revolution that started September 16th of last year, even that was not enough. It took a lot of effort. It took a lot of beatings, a lot of eyes were blinded, literally, in the protests. A lot of people were beaten up. Too many people were executed. Too many people were brutalized, raped in prisons, tortured in prisons, before the Western media and the Western audiences started to react to the atrocities that were taking place in Iran. And we were feeling the frustration that, first of all, a murder had to be publicized at such level of magnitude for people to start to feel any level of compassion and relationship with the women of Iran, as if Iranian women were not counted enough compared to the global movement of Me Too and the right to abortion and right to equal pay, all of these other intricacies for equality for women. It's just equality for Western women to Western men, but it was never equality between Iranian women and Western women. They were perceived as unequal entities in the first place. And many of us activists were frustrated that it had to take so much violence before finally some hearts would open and some level of solidarity were to be expressed. And now, with respect to the most recent atrocities against Israeli women, we are seeing that level of indifference being repeated. And there is even encouragement for this indifference because somehow Israeli women are being perceived or represented as not human enough, or as oppressors, as if there is a level of deserving that needs to that is there, and justifying the brutalities that were unleashed on them. So it's just mind-boggling. And the only way that I can explain it, Irina, is that there is a double standard, that Western feminist activists are just focused on their own interests. They are focused on their own culture. There is a level of superiority, perhaps, and self-preservation and self-interest. And I had to say it's selfishness that exists among the Western feminists, that their advocacy doesn't seep into the lives of women in the Middle East. And I am very hurt, frankly, by this level of indifference and aloofness toward our women, whether they're Israeli women or Iranian women. It seems like certain level of political narratives, whether it is the narrative of non-involvement in the case of Iranians, or the narrative of supposed oppressor that justifies the indifference and aloofness and lack of action and empathy on behalf of the movement.
This whole narrative of oppressor, oppressed starts to fall apart when you start looking at each case separately, because in any society you will have both. You will have predators who prey on innocent people, you will have criminals, you have people abusing power to varying degrees depending on the society structure. In Iran, it's fair to say that there are women who are involved in regime policies, there are women who are involved in the enforcement of violence against other women, and then there are women, young women, especially protesters, human rights defenders, lawyers, who end up being on the receiving end of this brutality, violence, injustice, and so forth. So it is fascinating to me that dynamic of the fact that there are women participating in the abuses and there are also women fighting it. It has not reached the level of discourse about other issues. When we are seeing anti-Israel rhetoric, it doesn't distinguish between Israeli women who are perceived as quote-unquote powerful and very, very left-wing peace activists who've been promoting dialogue and so forth. Hamas didn't distinguish between them. Iran didn't distinguish between them. And Western societies certainly do not make that distinction when they're talking about Israel's alleged human rights violations and all of that. And they certainly do not draw any distinctions between Iran's level of brutality and territorial disputes in varying parts of the world, and also the fact that Hamas has a genocidal charter which Iran has very eagerly embraced and supported, especially recently. So all of that leads me to ask this more general question before we get into the specifics of this conflict. Is it even possible to generate enough social interest to keep any sort of activism going long enough to make any sort of impact abroad? Can Americans and Europeans actually be able to project any sort of impact in this day and age? Because as I mentioned, a year ago, even with all this hard work, it was possible to generate some level of social outrage, push Iran out of the Human Rights Committee, however temporary that might be, and essentially get a conversation started. A year later, women continue to die in Iran. We don't hear about them beyond a couple of articles here and there. There's certainly no level of activism on the street, and all these people who were so outraged a year ago have moved on to other topics. Is it possible to keep anyone's attention on anything if Iranians and Iranian women in particular have repeatedly called on moral support from Western societies? Can they really count on it if the attention span here is the length of a typical TikTok video?
It's an important question. I think that a lot of it really begins with top-down policies. And I think we have had top-down policies of appeasement that for too long shaped the public opinion and fossilized a false narrative about, the oppressor and the oppressed, that put America and the Western world in general in the position of perpetual oppressors, and therefore perpetual responsibility for apologizing and ignoring whatever is happening in those countries with the excuse of non-intervention. Basically, there's been a fear of our intervention, or antagonizing the notion of America being the policeman of the region. And that has allowed us to become passive bystanders of watching atrocities happen in Syria and not say anything. Watching, the first Ukraine invasion take place. And again, we were told to not pay attention and just let them do their thing. Basically these, and again, like ongoing problems in Iran, ongoing problems in Iraq, basically Iraq was used as an excuse for just closing shop on foreign policy and just letting all the evildoers do their evils, and us will not get involved. And we forgot the philosophical implications of this, that when you let injustice continue and prevail, you are contributing to the injustice. When you let a war to continue, a civil war to continue, and cause mass casualty in a country and in a region, and you have the ability to stop that, and you don't stop it, you're complicit and you're contributing to that war. And we saw that happen, for the past 10 years and even before that. And anytime we did get involved in this, we had to apologize for any shortcoming. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was another form of apology. Instead of fixing it, we withdrew, and we allowed for worse atrocities to take place, and we just put blinders on so that we don't feel bad about our role in not stopping those atrocities from taking place. And I think that for some time, you can close your eyes and you can just have cat videos on TikTok to blind people and allow them to be entertained with stupid things and not really recognize what is happening. But eventually, we're going to start seeing these atrocities and global non-intervened atrocities, and we're going to see them in our peripheral vision. And eventually, our consciousness is going to kick in, and we're going to demand that some things will be done differently from now on. Now, we are going to always have those people in the fringes with tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of followers on social media who will try to dominate the conversation. Nonetheless, I think I am hopeful that despite what they say about the aloofness and the indifference of Gen Z generation, I think that there will be eventually some level of activism and humanitarian awakeness that is going to be revealed and hopefully change things.
In the meantime, Iran has certainly taken advantage of this relatively passive Western social response in a myriad of ways, and by proliferating proxies and abuses throughout all of the Middle East, whether it's in Yemen with Houthis who are as oppressive to the women there as Iran itself is, if not more, various militias in Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah, everyone's most familiar proxy relationship in the region. And now, as we see, also with the Palestinians, with Hamas, and even increasingly Judea and Samaria, or as many people know, the West Bank under the PA control of Mahmoud Abbas. So there's been a lot, written about how Hamas funds all these proxies and how it's in general has a strong symbiotic relationship with all these terrorist groups and militias. But the White House has taken to the position that while Iran is certainly complicit with the general support for Hamas and its fellow travelers in the region, they have not found evidence substantiating the direct involvement of Iran in the October 7th attack by Hamas. So I'd like to zero in on that, because to me there seems to be a bit of a conflicting statement, because we have seen a number of smoking gun reporting from credible sources, including the Wall Street Journal, and one of those biggest tells that about Iran's involvement has been actually an older report from 6 months ago, around the April Ramadan riots, when Iranian officials traveled to Beirut, inciting both Gaza and Hezbollah to attack Israel, which the PIJ did. Hamas at the time was still downplaying its role in regional upheaval, but the Palestinian Islamic Jihad certainly followed through, and this direct incitement points to some level of apparent relationship with specific events and not merely a general sort of funding for whatever causes. So how is it that this level of relationship between Iran and PIJ and Hamas and Hezbollah prompted very little concern from the US and other security agencies? Even if Hamas itself was not participating in that particular attack, there were other entities that were being directly incited by Iran towards ongoing violence. There was very little about it, and now all of a sudden it's all but forgotten. What's going on here?
It's hard to know exactly how to draw the clean lines between who did what, in the hours before the October 7th attack. But what we know for the past 43 years, since the inception of the Islamic Republic in Iran, is that the Iranian regime has had three main goals. One was enmity toward Israel, and the promise or the so-called mission to destroy the so-called Zionist entity. From the get-go, this was one of the main objectives and tenets of the Islamic Republic. Second was the destruction of the United States. And third was the persistence and livelihood of its own interest and entity at any cost. So you could say that the last one is a domestic policy, and the first two are foreign policy agendas of the Islamic Republic. But you can also see the relationship between the domestic agenda and the foreign policy agenda of the Islamic Republic. The enmity toward the US and Israel was always used as an excuse to explain why the Islamic Republic was not providing basic needs and essentials for its own citizens. There was always this narrative of blame of Israel and the US for any of the shortcomings that the Islamic Republic had in delivering the needs of their own people. So, and they really need this perpetual enmity toward US and Israel in order to keep the fire alive in the domestic arena. The landscape is arguably changing now, because after 43 years, the Iranian people, it's a new generation. They know their reality. They know that what should be given to them to to help them feed their families, to build schools, to build hospitals, to get COVID vaccines, etc., was all invested in the proxies of the Islamic Republic abroad, to fulfill mission A and mission B. So right now, there is a moment of reckoning inside Iran, because they're experiencing weakness on a domestic level. Regardless of how you evaluate the success of the Women Life Freedom movement from last September, there is an undeniable level of unrest and dissatisfaction in Iran that is taking place right now. And also a new level of awareness, actually an increasing level of awareness about the fact that enmity toward Israel really doesn't get them anything. Whether the state of Israel exists or if it doesn't exist, it will not make their lives better in any way. That Iran, the Islamic Republic, God forbid, even if they were to get rid of Israel, they will continue the war elsewhere, and they will never really rest easy until they have taken over the world and globalize the revolution. So the people of Iran are just casualties of this enmity, and they will not benefit from it. But going back to your question about how do you draw the lines in this? The line begins with the Islamic Republic's tenet and mission. They have instigated this for 43 years. They have funded this for 43 years. They have provided $700 million to their proxies in Lebanon with Hezbollah. They have established like 4 or 5 entities in Iraq, the Badr organization, the Katiba Hezbollah, the Asib al-Haq, the Harakat al-Hezbollah, the Masters of Martyrs Brigade, in Syria with the Zainabiyun and Fatimiyun refugees from Pakistan and Afghanistan, who are basically ready to be deployed to do what? To destroy Israel. By the way, just a footnote, a humanitarian footnote about the Zainabiyun and Fatimiyun. These are refugees who have escaped very difficult conditions in their own countries. In the case of the Afghan refugees, they were Hazaras who were heavily discriminated against in their own country. And they have come to Iran for some better life, with the hope of a better life. But they are deprived of identity cards. They're deprived of basic humanitarian needs. But they're incentivized to go and fight Iran's useless, pointless wars in these regions, saying that if you go and fight wars for us, we will give your families subsidies, identification cards, some money so they can live with a modicum of dignity in Iran. So they are basically funding wars in Yemen, and then, of course, as we know, with Hamas. Maybe we can say that, yes, Ayatollah Khamenei didn't pick up the phone and say, hey, guys, go ahead and do whatever you have to do on October 7th. Maybe it wasn't as clear as this, but the instigation has been ongoing. And the reward is still present. Khamenei, days after this atrocious attacks were unleashed on Israeli civilians, he said, well, you know what? I didn't really tell them to do it, but I commend them for what they have done. I kiss the faces of the engineers and designers of this beautiful, selfless, courageous act. And he basically encouraged them and gave them the go-ahead and pat on the back to continue their acts of atrocities and violence on Israelis. But then again, you could say that at the same time that they instigate and they are consumed by this notion of perpetual war and perpetual enmity, they're also afraid of the combined might of Israel and the US. As a non-military observer without any knowledge, I think that the reason why they're trying to hold off and ask for the so-called ceasefires or humanitarian pauses, because they want to refuel Hamas and their entities. They want to get themselves ready in case there is an all-out war for their alliances. It's interesting. I was thinking about how they have created this multi-pronged axis of evil, modern day axis of evil in these areas, and in a way they have created their own NATO organization, and if they feel like one side is being attacked, they will mobilize and they will engage. And unlike any other experiences that we have seen, any other past histories that we have seen of warfare, these people are not afraid of dying. They see death as a medal, as an achievement, and you don't see that in any other. You don't see it as much in any other region, in any other culture, but for them, they're incentivized by death. So the logic of warfare is really warped, and it is very difficult to reckon with that. And I think that complicates things further for people behind the scenes in the U.S. and Israel, who are envisioning a proper response to these potential attacks.
So we have seen a lot of signs that Iran is going far beyond mere rhetorical support. For instance, another Wall Street Journal report has shown that 500 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters were training for something in Iran a month before the attack. So clearly there's an ongoing relationship. And since then, we have seen Hamas leaders from Qatar travel back and forth to Iran with complete impunity. And this has been part of an ongoing process for years. At what point will the international community say enough is enough? We have seen evidence that even if you didn't give the direct order for this specific set of circumstances, Iran was certainly aware that something big was being planned. They certainly wanted something to happen because they were providing all these fighters with military training, with weapons. None of that could be considered just normal humanitarian aid. Obviously, they were hoping for some sort of aggression against Israel at some point in time. The bigger the better, because the resources have been very, very significant. So at what point will Iran be held very strongly accountable for this reign of terror that has broken out around the region? And we are now seeing multiple entities involved simultaneously against Israel, but also against US forces, against neighboring countries. And the escalation that everyone is warning about is already happening. It's already there. It's not something aspirational. It is in process. At what point will the international community intervene to disrupt this escalation?
I think what they are evaluating, again, as a non-military expert, they are, because right now the flames of the war are pretty intense, the equation that they have to count against is whether their intervention will escalate the war or not, whether they're, maybe Syria would have been an easier situation. Maybe Ukraine 10 years ago would have been an easier situation. But right now, as after 10 years, all of these entities, and Russia is now also siding with Iran, Turkey siding with Iran. I think the dynamics have changed. The powers have shifted, and they have to make sure that their involvement will not escalate the war into more devastating proportions, but rather would be efficient and quick and put an end to things. and I think after years of denial, years of putting their heads in the sand and pretending like, you know, behavior change will eventually come with the Islamic Republic, or the hope that, you know, with some incentives they will become a normal state, and they will be a normal player in the international arena. I think eyes are wide open right now, and they realize that they could never expect the Islamic Republic to participate as a normal entity, but they have to really have a very hard look at themselves and evaluate whether they have the capacity to engage in what could be a very difficult war with an Iranian regime that is probably, you know, we are also not really hearing about their state of accomplishment with the nuclear weapons. Is anybody even watching that? Where are they? Last thing I heard before October was that they are weeks away. Do they have nuclear weapons now? It's a very, you know, we have allowed, the Western world has allowed for Iran to become a Frankenstein's monster, and they have to know whether they can tackle it on their own or not.
But you know, here's the thing. I'd like to push back on a couple of things. First of all, the international community involves, you know, strong leading defense alliances such as NATO, and on the other hand, you have the Arab world, which has claimed to see Iran as a major existential threat to their own interests, and yet is now siding with Hamas and downplaying Iran's involvement in this chaos that's endangering lives and contributing to humanitarian disasters absolutely all around the Middle East. And they're also witnessing the fact that the escalation is ongoing even without anybody else's additional involvement, because we have seen Hezbollah become increasingly more involved on the northern front, not as involved as people fear, but still their presence has grown. We have seen the Houthis for the first time shoot missiles all the way into the stratosphere, so to speak, which has not happened before against Israel. That's for sure. We have seen this escalation, against U.S. troops, with over 40 attacks in just a month. Which is quite significant. So this escalation is entirely unilateral, unprovoked by any additional physical threat from anybody in the international community. There's no reason for any of these entities to stop, even with the U.S. deterrence in place, because they see that U.S. is reluctant to use the deterrence, and so they are pushing the envelope and they're getting away with it. They just shut down an American drone. So that's one issue. The other issue is domestically, none of these countries are taking measures against Iran where they can. There is no cutting of the funding to Iranian operations, influence operations. There is no end to Iranian propagandists. And even Ariane Tabatabai, to name names, as we have seen in Semaphore, got to keep her clearance in a very sensitive political position, and that's just the US. I think Europe is probably equivalent, if not worse, and there's probably less pressure to expose such activity there. So, yes, maybe people have a reason to hold off on military involvement, but surely there are non-military things that they could reevaluate. Why isn't that happening? What is everyone waiting for or hoping for?
I think the Western world has changed. I just think about when the war on Ukraine began, and the level of resistance that some countries showed to doing the right thing and supporting the Ukrainians. In the middle of war, Zelensky had to go get on Zooms and literally solicit country after country for support. To make the case for this war, and Ukrainians, so many people until then didn't even know how to locate Ukraine on the map, and they didn't really care about Ukraine. They did not have an opinion, positive or negatively, about Ukraine. It was not part of the vernacular of Western households as much. But Israel has been. Israel has been for the past, especially for the past 40 years since the Islamic Revolution has been in place, and they have used their propaganda machines, not just in textbooks in Palestinian regions and in their proxy locations, but even trying to influence textbooks in America, through indirect influencers, trying to feed the whole narrative of Israel as the oppressor and America as an interventionist, imperialist force that imposes its own culture on other countries. They have been putting that in mind. And I think that after decades of being fed this kind of propaganda, I hate to say it, I think we have become soft. And there are still people who are mad at America because of Vietnam, who are not willing to let go of that. And because of the failures of Vietnam War and the failures of Iraq War, they think that we should never be involved in anything, even if the world is burning around us. We should just stay there and watch it, and call ourselves pacifists for letting the fires of the globe burn around us. But I think that some of it is this is the public opinion battle that is taking place. If you look at the movement that is happening on college campuses, the expressions, the anti-Israel expressions that are being manifested on college campuses, and to some extent in the streets, it's the Greens, it's the Green movement, environmentalists, the LGBTQ folks, who probably have never understood what Hamas stands for, along with the pan-Islamists who are mobilized, and by the way, using very Iranian doctrine and toolkits in this new wave of protests and unrest that they're showing in the streets around the world. So what I think is that before we can get to that, we have to get over partisanship and the divisions that exist here in the US, and I'm just going to speak for the US. We need to get over those partisanships and stop seeing matters of national security, matters of international relations as a Republican priorities or the Democratic priorities. I think they are American priorities, and it should be everybody's business to pay attention to those. Second, we have to really hold our media accountable for the way they are shaping public opinion by the stories and the method of reporting that is taking place, right now in this current Israel-Hamas war, and before that. There are very disturbing reports about the potential photographers who accompanied these terrorists. And if that was true, if it is true that that media outlets from Reuters and others knew about this potential attacks, it comes from the fossilized and false notions that Hamas are not a terrorist entity, that they are a militant or a government or a political entity. And these notions need to be clarified and retaught from scratch. But again, because the trust in media is also being dissipated, we are going to have a lot of chaos and a lot of confusion, because people are not going to know who to trust, what media outlet to believe in. And with the prevalence of social media and TikTok contents that you refer to, but which is not just limited to TikTok, it's across the board with X and Instagram, etc. We're going to need to have reliable information in an atmosphere where there is no trust and there is a ton of confusion. The mindset needs to be cleared up before we can move to taking out weapons and whether strike against the potential perpetrators or defend ourselves before in the case of unfortunately a potential strike against us.
Well, all of that is very reasonable, but here's the dilemma. All the conversations I've been hearing about dealing with these soft power institution takeovers by radicals, fellow travelers, Hamas and Iran sympathizers, they all talk about long-term solutions of cutting off foreign funding, which is long overdue, certainly, reviewing the curriculum, providing students with critical thinking training at an earlier age, and so on and so forth. All of that pretends well for decades down the road, if that's even accomplished. But what to do with the entire generations of young people who've already been indoctrinated, who have zero impetus to review their own positions, and quite frankly, generations of Middle East study experts, policymakers who are coming from those circles, completely indoctrinated at the universities, failing to review, to read anything extraneous outside their academic curriculum, and sharing these completely morphed views. If you think some of the policymakers making statements in Congress and other institutions today are bad, imagine if there's significantly more of them coming up, 10, 15 years down the road. So what do we do about this program that's already been created, that is not going to be changed by pushing universities to do better in the future, because these people are already there and they're already in the pipeline?
I think that the instigators of disinformation need to be removed from our academic institutions. So we have to first stop the bleed before we can do the operation on the problems that we have. And I think that the first point of operation, the first point is to stop these entities that are really dividing and spreading disinformation and promoting hate and violence. They need to be stopped. Whether there are SJP chapters or SJP as an entity, it needs to be dismantled. They need to be investigated, and any foreign funding that that potentially is fueling them needs to be revealed, and they need to pay the consequences for that. But secondly, in terms of professors, many of them probably have chair positions funded by foreign entities. I think American universities have to rethink those relationships and opt to have independence over their own institutions, and maintain intellectual academic integrity rather than selling out to this and that country and putting academic values up for sale. So, but again, that it also becomes a long-term solution, because until minds are changed, new opinions are formed, it's going to take time. So for me, I think that as a human rights activist, I think perhaps the most effective strategy will take time, but it is really to remind indifferent observers and people who are on the sidelines, who are watching and not really reacting one way or another, is to really have one-on-one conversation with those individuals and remind them that humans are humans. Iranians are humans, Israelis are humans, Palestinians are humans, no one deserves to be butchered or burned alive. No political wrongdoing can ever justify such inhumane, such barbaric treatment to be imposed on them. And we have to be consistent about our standards for how we see prejudice, how we treat discrimination, how we treat rights for human beings. It should not be the rights for certain human beings. It should not be rights to discriminate against some people, but not others. It has to be equal. It has to be free. Those were the reasons why I came to America. And I really hope to God that those values of freedom, of fairness, of equality, of non-discrimination, of separation of religion and government could once again be restored here, and that people would be seen as equal human beings, regardless of how they pray, where they come from, what language they speak, or who they love.
I do agree that in the long term, better education, return to U.S. original, values is the way to fight it, and I do think that way will ultimately prevail. For now, Iran and its proxy networks seem to be waging a very effective information warfare, and judging by the mobs of violent fellow travelers and sympathizers, they are, if not winning the war itself, at least dealing very serious blows. The only good news I see here is that despite the fact that we are facing a very immediate problem that does not lend itself to these long-term solutions, is the fact that for the first time we are acknowledging that warfare exists, that it's effective, that it's happening, and that we do at least have that problem. So at the very least, we are no longer pretending that it's something that will just outgrow itself on its own volition. It will not. We have people, potential lawmakers, potential human rights activists who are dominated by a completely warped view of the world, and who will be carrying water for entities like Iran and like Hamas, even if they think that they mean well, simply because they have been completely indoctrinated and are ignorant of realities and refuse to break out of the boxes.
Irina, you're not exaggerating. Honestly, you're really not exaggerating. You're not saying, some people may look at this conversation and think that we're just spewing propaganda, but I encourage you, if you're skeptical of what we're saying here, go and take a look at Amnesty International's Instagram post. Count for yourself. How many times did they come in defense of women and minorities in Iran? How many times did they actually help people who were arrested, tortured in Iran? And then look at this period since October 7th and see how many times they have spoken against Israel. How many times they condemned the atrocities that took place in Israel against innocent civilians, and just have an honest numbers evaluation, numeric evaluation, and you will see the discrepancy that exists there. Human Rights Watch, the same. Look at how many times they condemned the atrocities that took place on October 7th. And now compare them to how many times they have condemned the retaliation of Israel against Hamas in Gaza. They speak for themselves. Look at what they have said about Iran. Count that for the past year and compare that to the number of times they have spoken in the past month in defense of Gaza and the Palestinians. Yes, we have to defend the innocent Palestinians. It's a responsibility of all of us as human beings. But we have to treat all humans as equal. We have to recognize that if you're siding with human life of the Palestinians, you have to also side with the human life of Israelis, of Iranians, of the Uyghurs, of all the other people, the tens of thousands of people in Pakistan. Nobody's talking about them. So where does this double standard come from? And why is it okay to ignore the suffering and loss of Israelis and Jews, but prioritize others? Why is it?
I think that's a question that we should be asking every time when we invite these human rights experts and commentators to come to when we give them platforms. These are the questions they should be challenged with. They should not be given a completely free platform to say whatever they want simply because they have a big name and a reputation. I think the problem with credentialism that gives uncritical support for anyone with a big name and a big fund to say anything they wish is what brought us to this situation to begin with, where these organizations are no longer accountable to the truth and are being used to shape the public opinion, as you pointed out, which serves dictatorships and human rights abusers and war criminals. So that is not a place. I think and I hope that present and future American administrations, both Democrat and Republicans, will review their relationships with these entities and start looking at more diverse sources of information on all issues, not just around everything, China, Russia, Latin America, whatever. Do not rely on a few known sources simply because they're known. That process becomes abusive. The wider your base of knowledge, the more likely you are to get it right at the end of the day. So that's the only thing I can think of. I just hope that we will continue having broader conversations, have solution-oriented conversations and practical conversations about steps to take to counter a problem that we now acknowledge exists. And thank you so much for shedding more light on this and bringing attention to this topic, because we need more credible voices and fewer people just shouting past each other and at each other.
I agree, and thank you for providing this open space to speak about these issues. And I hope that we will make a difference, and people, who are curious about these issues will do a little bit more research and find the truth for yourselves and really look at human beings as equals.
Thank you so much. That was Marjan Greenblatt. We've been discussing Iran's complicity and role in regional upheaval, starting with very much the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas, but which seems to be expanding even more into regional confrontations with various Iran-backed proxies as well. And we'll be back next week, same time as usual, Tuesday night, 9 p.m., the Washington Outsider Report. Thank you so much for joining, for taking the time to listen, even though this is much longer than your typical TikTok video. And